Hello, and welcome to today's video on a relatively unknown female poet from the Ming Dynasty. We're going to be talking about Fang Weiyi, her life, family, poetry, and history, including some cultural context, some comparison to Europe and England in particular during an equivalent time period, and mostly what it means to be a woman writer. Before that, some background on myself so you don't take anything I'm about to say too seriously. I'm an American college student majoring in literature who loves poetry. While I have always been interested in Chinese poetry, this is in no way an area of expertise for me. I do know some about English poetic history, some history in general, and some gender studies stuff, but the main goal with this video is to ask questions and spark interest. Hopefully, you learn something new. But if you don't, I hope at the very least you find something new to Google. Starting with Fang Weiyi. Weiyi was born in 1585 to the relatively prosperous Fang family in Tongchang, in the Anhui province. If you don't know where that is, it's near the eastern side of China by the coast, but not actually on the ocean. This is a relatively wealthier area of China, but not one of the most prosperous areas, even during this time period. She was financially supported, educated in her youth, and her family was relatively well connected. Her older sister, Fang Mengshi, who was also a poet, married someone who went on to be a governor. That being said, it wasn't like she was royalty, just upper class. As a note, her given name was Zhongxian, so she would have been Fang Zhongxian. But as was typical of the time, she had a style or courtesy name, which is what she was called by her contemporaries, that being Wei Yi. This is what I will be calling her and what she is best known by. Back to the story. She was married at 17 to Yao Xunqi, who was ill at that time and had been for years. Despite Wei Yi doing her best to care for him, he died within the same year of their marriage, leaving her pregnant and alone. She gave birth to a daughter, but that daughter died before she was a year old. Wei Yi was grief-stricken, understandably. Women Writers of Traditional China, an instrumental anthology in English collecting poetry, biographical details, and commentary on Chinese women writers throughout history, puts it best when they write. No biographer, however sympathetic, can depict the hardships of Fang Weiyi's life better than she herself did in her poems. Not only did her marriage and family life go poorly, but then she lived through the Qing conquest, a time of terrifying violence and social upheaval. That being said, not all her poetry is about grief or war. It's only that these events changed the course of her life and shaped both her and her poetry into the form that they are. Her sister, Mengshi, said, "The arts became Wei's soul's spiritual haven after the loss of her husband and child. As a widow, she had little else to do. She returned to her birth family and helped her brother's wife raise his son, Fang Yizhi. Yizhi would go on to be a notable philosopher. Of the members of their family around this time, he is by far the most famous, and it would be easy to define Wei or Mengshi in relation to him, as they are his aunts. However, this is reductive at best. Both Wei and Mengshi made individual contributions to the fields of literature, which they deserve respect for. It does bother me, though, that on Yizhi's Wikipedia page, there isn't like a single mention of any of his female family members, despite while not being like the most relevant people in history, them having published works, you'd think they would at least get like, this is his mother, this is his aunt, here's a link to their page. But no. But back to Wei Yi. She was both a poet, a painter, and a calligrapher, and she also edited, made anthologies, and wrote about women's history. All three of her books on this latter topic, women's history, unfortunately have been lost to time, but we know their titles, which were Gongui Shi Shi, Gongui Wen Shi, and Gongui Shi Ping, which are the history of poetry in palace and boudoir, history of prose in the same, and then the criticism of palace and boudoir poetry, respectively. It's unfortunate that they've been lost, but just the fact that an average woman poet from the time was involved not only with poetry writing, but also creating the historical narrative of women's poetry tells us something. Looking at England for reference, the first book of original poetry published by women in English was Amelia Lanier's Salve Deus in 1611. Coincidentally, that's the same year that Fang Yizhi was born. Regardless, One of the most interesting things about this book, other than it being a monumental step in women's history, is the fact that Amelia Lanier only dedicates it to women. Particularly, she spends time to talk about how great so many of her contemporaries, the literary women of the time, are. Some of this is just her looking for patronage, seeking money from the wealthier women, but some of this is easy to interpret as a sort of community or culture building, as writing a narrative of women's writing, of their intelligence, their contributions, and marking it down in history. In other words, part of the revolutionary nature of Amelia Lanier's writing was her centering of women. Meanwhile, at the same time, halfway across the world, women were publishing anthologies of only women's writing, and commentaries, and histories. I don't want to come across as saying, like, oh, look how progressive China was and how backwards England was. Wow. Because primarily, I'm not a historian or an anthropologist. That's not in my wheelhouse. But secondly, I think positioning these things as some sort of linear march towards modern perspectives is not really helpful in understanding what was going on. Instead, I brought this up because it's different from the reference points that I have, and I want to understand more about the circumstances that enabled this to happen. So, to get to that point, firstly, were the circumstances in Ming China unusual for Chinese history? Kind of. Ming and the later Qing Dynasty had an explosion of female poets. These are some of the times that have the most women's poets in history across the world. Fang Weiyi, in particular, was from the late Ming, so there were already plenty of female predecessors for her to look up to. But there was also a longer history of women's poetry from before the Ming. In fact, in her intro to her sister's work, she comments on her sister growing up and practicing by emulating Xie Daoyun's poetry. Xie Daoyun lived in the latter half of the 4th century, that being the 300s. Long time ago. However, literally a sentence later, she comments that her father often said, "I would love to have a son like her. Too bad that she is a girl." Welp. Oh well. Looking at this, it's clear that poetic talent was desirable and respected in women. However, it was also desirable in men, and those men had greater opportunity, and thus were more desirable overall. Kang-i Sun Chang, in her essay Ming Qing Women Poets and Cultural Androgyny, argues that the literary sphere was one of androgyny, where women and men pursued the same ideals, were respected similarly, and behaved in similar ways. She mentions women wearing traditionally male clothing, and men pursuing a pure female spirit. This idea of androgyny is interesting in the context of Weiyi and Mengshir's father's comments. Why should gender matter if it's largely irrelevant to the literati culture of the time, which is what both Weiyi and Mengshir were interacting with? Because poetic talent was also important for politics. To pass the civil service exam, you had to have a knowledge of literature, and so if a boy had a knowledge of literature, was good at poetry, then it was likely that they could get a good political career out of it, whereas this option was not available for Mengshi. In the latter half of her essay, Chung details how part of the reason this culture was increasingly androgynous was the growing disregard for these exams, however. Women were kept for politics and the taking of the exams on the basis of gender, but men were also influenced by these exams. It was like a gate which kept them out of politics. And so maybe from pride, maybe from just the fact that the population was growing and the opportunities were not as available, started to reach for a different culture, a new literary authority that wasn't just taking uh, exam success as the determination of what was valuable or what was right. But disregarding those exams in this way put them on the sidelines with women in the same cultural space. And since they were pushing aside the old authority, that meant at the same time they had to make a new authority, which was made at this collectively with women. This also happened at the same time as I said, the economy and population were booming, and courtesan culture in particular was thriving because of that, because, people spending money, seeing performances. and like people gathered all in one big city really encourages this sort of culture. Many of these women, trained in music and dance, also turned to poetry during this period. Most of the women writers of the era were performers. However, this was not a social class like the ones in Europe that were locked and immobile. Courtesans came from lower and upper classes, though their background did influence how they were treated. The reason it matters that this was a fluid kind of social class is because, unlike being a noble or prosperous family, being a courtesan was accessible to pretty much any woman. So if someone really wanted to do poetry, while this wasn't a great option, maybe not a universally good career choice, it was a career choice and it was a option for people, which is very different than, for example, like Fang Weiyi. She had access to poetry because of how she was born. Being a courtesan means that both talented people, regardless of their birth, had access to poetics and literature and studying that sort of thing. So Fang Weiyi is actually not very representative of the typical Ming Dynasty female poet. However, her difference is how she accessed the circumstances which allowed her to write poetries and the culture which allowed her to write poetry, not what those actual circumstances were. The opportunities that created the option for her to write are intertwined with the ones that influenced her peers who are performers. When talking about how women find the opportunity to write, one of the most relevant pieces of Western literature is Virginia Woolf's famous A Room of One's Own. While she was ultimately wrong, since we have discovered numerous women who did write even during highly patriarchal times in English history, she still raises some interesting questions. What is it that enables women to write? Time? Money? Education? Familial or cultural support? Personal space? I'm not certain. All of them to some degree. And almost all of these factors are present for both wealthy widows like Fang Weiyi and courtesans like Liu Rushi, her contemporary. This might explain some of the poetic boom during the Ming Dynasty. I don't know, and I'm not going to make any conclusions on this topic, but I do think I've spent a lot of time talking about culture and not a lot of time talking about Weiyi and her poetry, and I think it would be awful disrespectful to write a video about a poet and not actually showcase any of their work. We're going to be reading a single poem in translation just to end the video off, and that's going to be While Traveling in Autumn, I Hear of the Invading Bandits. At autumn portals crickets hum, a cool wind rises amid dusky peaks. In my declining years I run into troubled times. When will I return to my native land? Bandits invade the southern townships. Military orders are dispatched to the northern passes. Human horror is at its height. Layers of blood coat our swords to the hilt. I believe this version is translated by Paula Varsano. It's the version found in Women Writers of Traditional China. I chose this poem because, firstly, I enjoy it. I think it's good. The pairs of lines feel very traditional to me, and it seems simple but effective, even though I'm sure things are lost in translation. Secondly, how historical women comment on political or societal circumstances through their poetry, and how they present and align themselves both interest me. The last two lines strike me for this, in the translated version at least. Who does the our refer to? All of humanity? The Han Chinese? Her country? Her local area? Her family? I'm not sure, but regardless, she is a part of it. The poem is unapologetic about being about her experience of these troubled times. And I find it really refreshing to read poetry from a woman who is not forced to make her poetic self small to appease others. That's all I have to say for now, but before you go, I want to thank all of the people who put together Women Writers of Traditional China. It was an excellent book, a great read that I highly recommend for anyone who likes poetry and our history, and incredibly useful in putting together this video. I also want to thank all the people who worked on the Ming Qing Women's Writing database, hosted by McGill University and the Harvard Library. While my literacy in Chinese is not good enough to make proper use of the documents at this point, it's incredible to see that all of these women's work is kept somewhere where they can be appreciated and preserved. If you do happen to be fluent, please go check out the site. It's incredible. There will be a link in the description along with all of my other sources. Finally, thank you all for listening, and I hope you enjoyed. Bye bye!